If you ever thought living in ancient Greece would be like stepping into a marble dream filled with gods, wisdom, and heroic adventure, you might want to close your eyes and take a nap instead. Because the truth is far more tiring than inspiring. The air of Athens at dawn wasn't scented with poetry or philosophy, smelled of smoke, olive oil, and the sweat of people who had already begun their day hours before sunrise. The city stirred slowly, not because people were lazy, but because every ounce of energy had to be saved for survival. There was no alarm clock, no coffee, and certainly no bathroom as you know it. Just the sound of roosters and neighbors muttering as they hauled clay jars to the communal fountain. If you were a citizen, you might think yourself lucky, but being a citizen didn't mean comforted, meant obligation. You were expected to participate in public duties, attend assemblies, and serve in the military if needed, all while managing your household. For women, the world was even smaller. They were rarely seen in public, confined to weaving and cooking, living behind the thick walls of homes that looked plain and windowless from the street. Privacy wasn't a luxury. It was a boundary meant to keep women unseen. For slaves, there was no boundary at all. Lonely, endless work, cleaning, building, and enduring the constant reminder that their existence belonged to someone else. The streets were narrow, dusty, and loud, filled with animals, carts, and the cries of vendors selling everything from olives to fish. No one had shoes like yours. Most walked barefoot, their feet calloused from the hot stones. Imagine spending your day in sandals made from rough leather. No socks, no cushion, and every step reminding you that comfort was not a Greek invention. Meals were practical, not pleasant. A breakfast might be a crust of bread soaked in watered-down wine. Maybe a few olives, if you were lucky, eaten quickly before heading out to work. There were no fancy pastries, no sweet honeyed cakes for the average person, and certainly no coffee to wake the mind. The men gathered at the Agora, that famous market square that history books make sound so glamorous. But in reality, it was noisy, chaotic, and full of flies. Philosophers like Socrates or Plato might have wandered through, but so did butchers, gossipers, and beggars. The air was thick with debate, yes, but also with the smell of fish left out too long under the sun. If you were a farmer, your life was even tougher. Fields stretched beyond the city walls, and tending them meant working under the fierce Mediterranean sun, plowing dry soil with oxen that moved slower than time itself. A single day could feel endless, and a bad harvest could mean hunger for months. The concept of rest was foreign. Even when you weren't working, you were preparing to work again. The homes of ordinary Greeks were simple stone walls, clay floors, and little furniture. A bed was a wooden frame with a stuffed sack of straw, maybe covered with animal skin if you were wealthy enough. Water had to be fetched daily, firewood gathered constantly, and every household relied on oil lamps that filled the air with smoke. There were no doors to close out the noise, no glass windows, only cloth or wooden shutters that did little to block the wind or the heat. Yet, somehow, life continued in a rhythm both tedious and relentless. The men who prided themselves on democracy spent hours in assembly halls arguing about taxes, wars, and public statues, while women spun wool, their hands never stopping. Even the children weren't spared from routine. Boys were trained for discipline and physical strength. while girls learned to weave, cook, and obey. Entertainment was rare. Festivals came only a few times a year, and even then they were exhausting days of marching, dancing, sacrifices, and ceremonies dedicated to gods who never answered prayers directly by midday. The city shimmered under the sun, the marble buildings reflecting heat like mirrors. Shade was precious. People hid under porticos or gathered near fountains to catch a breath of cool air. If you were lucky enough to be rich, you might enjoy a nap or a quiet discussion about poetry. If not, you kept working. Slaves carried water, cleaned courtyards, and prepared food for their masters, who might lecture them about virtue afterward. In this world, every role was fixed, every breath measured by tradition. Even beauty had rules. Women painted their faces pale to look delicate. Men oiled their bodies before exercise, and everyone feared growing old because strength was the only admired quality. At night, the glow of torches lit the city in amber tones, but it wasn't peaceful. Dogs barked, insects hummed, and the streets were unsafe. There were no police, only citizens on watch, armed with sticks and courage. Robbers lurked in alleys, and drunken men shouted in the distance. If you managed to make it home unscathed, you'd eat a modest dinner, maybe lentil soup, bread, and figsby for collapsing on that straw bed. Your body aching, your mind heavy, and yet, through all this, ancient Greeks still managed to create art, architecture, and ideas that shaped civilization. It's almost ironic. A people so busy surviving still found time to dream. They built temples that touched the sky, carved statues so lifelike they seemed ready to breathe, and invented stories that still echo today. But those achievements came at a price. For every marble column you admire now, someone's back bent under the weight of stone. For every scroll of philosophy, countless slaves copied the words by hand in dim lamplight. You wouldn't last long in that rhythm, not because you're weak, but because modern life has spoiled you with comfort. In Greece, there was no soft bed, no chilled water, no weekend, no Wi-Fi, and no break from the constant hum of labor. You couldn't simply call in sick, and if you dared to complain, you'd be told that suffering builds character. Even bathing wasn't simple. You had to heat water yourself or visit public baths where privacy disappeared. Hygiene was a luxury. Perfumes masked the truth. The irony of it all is that they believed their way of life was the peak of civilization, and in many ways it was. But for someone used to microwaves and air conditioning, it would feel like a slow, dusty eternity. So imagine yourself there now, the sky blindingly blue, your feet sore from walking on sun-baked stones, the taste of salty sweat on your lips. The only shade you find is under an olive tree where cicadas buzz lazily. You try to rest, but a farmer passes by with a cart, shouting to move. A philosopher nearby begins a loud debate about virtue, and a group of children run by chasing a wooden hoop. The world never pauses, and neither can you. The idea of me time doesn't exist. Your time belongs to the gods, the city, or your family. And when night falls, the silence isn't comforting. It's vast and full of thoughts. The stars gleam above you, ancient and indifferent, and you realize how small you are in a world without electricity, without speed, without escape. You lie there, staring up at the universe, hearing the faint laughter from a nearby house, where a family shares stories by firelight. Their words drift through the air, soft and tired, and for a brief moment, it feels timeless, boring, yes, but deeply human. And then you close your eyes, too weary to think, drifting into the same dream every Greek dreamed, that tomorrow will be a little easier, even if it never is. When the sun rose again over the uneven rooftops of Athens, there was no sense of freshness or excitement about the new day, only a familiar weariness that clung to the air like the dust that never settled. The people of ancient Greece didn't wake up with optimism. They woke up because they had to. The roosters crowed before dawn. The faint sound of sandals scraping stone echoed through the narrow streets. And the marketplace slowly began to hum with the rhythm of another day that looked exactly like the one before. The city wasn't grand everywhere, as you might imagine from the temples and statues. Most homes were small, plain, and built from sun-baked bricks that cracked with time. If you were a craftsman, the day meant laboring in a workshop where the only breeze came through a small hole in the wall. The sound of hammering, chiseling, and chatter filled the cramped spaces. And every mistake meant starting again from scratch, with no modern tools or shortcuts to save you. Work was slow, painfully precise, and often unappreciated, but you kept going because stopping meant hunger. The Greeks valued skill and effort, but they didn't romanticize suffering. They simply accepted it as part of existence. The gods might reward or punish, but rarely interfere. Life was a cycle of work, duty, and endurance, and philosophy was something you thought about only if your stomach was full and your debts were paid. For most, food dictated the flow of life. Without markets stocked with endless choices, meals were predictable and repetitive. Bread was made from barley or wheat, coarse and heavy, and it was often baked in communal ovens shared by the neighborhood. Women prepared the dough before sunrise, kneading it with calloused hands while listening to the faint murmur of gossip drifting through courtyards. Olive oil was treasured like gold-lit lamps, flavored food, and even cleaned skin. A drizzle could transform a dull meal into something bearable. Honey was the only sweetness, harvested with care from wooden hives guarded by angry bees, and only the wealthy could afford it regularly. Meat was rare. Animals were more valuable alive than on a plate used for labor or wool instead. Fish was common near the coast, but inland towns often went without. There was no variety, no indulgence, only survival flavored by necessity. Drinking water wasn't always safe, so diluted wine was the drink of choice, not for pleasure but practicality. Children sipped it too, learning early that luxury was an illusion. Even festivals that celebrated the gods revolved around food and sacrifice. But those days were more about community than joy, an exhausting combination of duty, ritual, and endless preparation. While the men moved through the agora debating politics, philosophy, and military matters, women remained ghosts within the household walls. Their world was smaller than a courtyard, defined by weaving looms, clay pots, and the faint scent of bread baking over coals. They weren't taught letters or rhetoric. Their wisdom came from repetition and silence. Every thread woven into a tunic was a story untold. Every stitch a mark of patience. A good woman was invisible, and her virtue was measured not by what she said, but by how quietly she obeyed. The irony of Greek society was sharp philosophers could argue for reason and democracy, yet half the population had no voice. If a woman dared to step outside without a male relative, whispers followed her like shadows. Slaves, too, had no escape from their stations. They were the unseen backbone of everything, hauling water, tending fires, and bearing the weight of civilization's pride. Some were educated, teaching children or managing homes, while others labored in the fields or mines, where the air was thick with dust and hopelessness. They had no promise of freedom, only the endurance to keep breathing from one day to the next. By midday, Athens shimmered like a mirage. The white marble of temples glowed too brightly to look at, and heat rose from the stone streets in visible waves. People sought shade where they could, under trees, in narrow alleys, or beneath the porticos of public buildings. The city's hum softened into the slow rhythm of fatigue. Philosophers might still argue in shaded corners, gesturing wildly about justice or virtue, but the ordinary citizens had simpler concerns: whether there would be enough water in the cistern, whether the harvest would survive, whether the child coughing in the corner would live through summer. There were no doctors, as you know them, just healers who mixed herbs, whispered prayers, and hoped the gods listened. Diseases were seen as curses, not infections, and recovery was often a matter of luck rather than medicine. The same hands that built temples also buried the dead, often too soon, often without ceremony. Life was fragile, and people lived with the quiet knowledge that tomorrow wasn't guaranteed. The evening brought some relief from the heat, but not from exhaustion. As the sun dipped into the horizon, its orange light washed over the Acropolis, turning marble into gold for a fleeting moment. Citizens gathered at small shrines, offering prayers and tiny gifts, oil, grain, or flowers, to gods who watched silently. The city smelled of smoke and sea salt, and for a brief hour, Athens seemed peaceful. Families ate their modest dinners while recounting small stories, often about heroes and monsters, because imagination was their escape. Children listened, wide-eyed, unaware that real life demanded more courage than any myth. Once the last light faded, torches flickered in the streets, casting long shadows against walls. Without electricity, night was a world of mystery and caution. Travelers hurried home before darkness swallowed the roads. Dogs barked at unseen shapes, and the air carried distant laughter from taverns where men shared wine and argued about glory. Even there, boredom lingered. Conversation was a sport, and silence was considered ignorance. Sleep came late, interrupted by the buzz of insects, the occasional drunk stumbling past, or the howl of the wind against wooden shutters. If you think this sounds romantic, imagine living it. Imagine every day beginning before sunrise, your hands rough from labor, your stomach never fully satisfied, and your mind trapped in the same circle of survival. The great minds of Greece, Aristotle, Socrates, Plato may have shaped philosophy, but they lived surrounded by the very monotony they sought to explain. Their thoughts about virtue and reason were born from a society that demanded endless endurance. Even beauty, so praised in Greek art, came with rules that chained the human spirit. Sculptures of perfect bodies hid the imperfections of real life, the crooked spines, the missing teeth, the scars of labor. To the Greeks, perfection was divine, and everything human was an imitation at best. That belief seeped into daily life, making even the simplest tasks a ritual of order and control. Children learned to recite poems before they could write. Soldiers drilled until their movements became one with the dust beneath their feet. And women folded fabric until their fingers bled, all in the name of discipline. There was no rebellion, no rush for change, just a steady acceptance that this was life. As the night deepened, the stars revealed themselves one by one, cold and bright, above the silent city. The moonlight touched the Parthenon, the temples, the homes of the living, and the tombs of the dead, uniting them all in a single pale glow. Somewhere, a poet whispered lines to himself, trying to capture the feeling of existence in words that would outlast his body. Somewhere else, a mother hummed to a restless child, her voice blending with the hum of the crickets. The world was simple, repetitive, and slow, yet deeply connected. Without the distractions of modern life, people were left with their thoughts, their gods, and their work. And maybe that's why boredom didn't destroy them. The silence of the night wasn't emptiness, it was reflection. The Greeks learned to find meaning in stillness, to see life not as a race, but as a pattern, repeating endlessly like waves against the shore. To live in ancient Greece was to live within that rhythm, to breathe, toil, and sleep beneath the same sky that watched over heroes and slaves alike. You wouldn't last long, not because it was unbearable, but because it was slow, so slow that it forced you to face yourself, stripped of noise, luxury, and distraction. And perhaps that is why it feels so foreign now. By the time the third sunrise painted the sky over Athens in pale gold, the city had already begun its slow, predictable awakening, a routine so deeply carved into time that it almost seemed eternal. The first sounds were always the same: roosters crowing, dogs barking, the faint clang of metal from a distant forge, and the rhythmic shuffle of feet against dry stone. There was a strange comfort in the sameness of it all. No surprises, no disruptions, only the steady hum of daily life repeating itself like an old song everyone knew by heart. For the Greeks, repetition wasn't boredom, it was order. They believed that discipline, habit, and balance kept chaos away. And perhaps that was why their civilization endured as long as it did. The men went about their duties, the women theirs, and the slaves theirs, all moving like parts of a great living machine powered by sweat and sunlight. The scent of baking bread and olive oil drifted through narrow alleys, mingling with the sharper smell of the sea breeze and the faint tang of smoke from kitchen fires. There was no rush, no notion of running late, because time wasn't measured by clocks, but by the sun's slow arc. Across the sky, the city itself was a paradox. Temples and proud statues rising above, streets filled with dirt, noise, and struggle. The Acropolis gleamed like a crown, visible from nearly every corner of Athens, a constant reminder that beauty could coexist with hardship. Yet beneath that splendor, ordinary life carried on in ways that would exhaust any modern visitor. A potter hunched over his wheel for hours, shaping clay with aching hands, his workshop hot and cramped. A shepherd trudged through rocky hills, guiding his flock along paths he'd walked since childhood, the same paths his father and grandfather had followed. A mother washed clothes in a basin, her fingers raw from scrubbing, humming softly to the baby tied to her back. The poet who dreamed of glory wrote his verses on cheap papyrus, knowing most people would never read them. And through it all, the sun burned relentlessly, bleaching the color from everything it touched. When you live under such heat, you move slower, speak less, and learn patience, because impatience doesn't cool the air. The markets opened, as always, bursting into life by mid-morning. Traders shouted, animals bleated, and the scent of fish and herbs mixed into a thick, almost tangible fog. Money changed hands, constantly small bronze coins that clinked softly in the palms of calloused hands. Some bartered instead, trading goods for favors or promises. Everyone knew everyone. Gossip traveled faster than news. A woman selling olives could tell you who was sick, who was in debt, and whose son had been caught sleeping during military drills. For entertainment, people didn't turn to screens or music, they turned to each other. Conversation was the heartbeat of Greek society, and no topic was too small for debate. From the price of bread to the meaning of virtue, everything could become an argument. The Greeks loved words almost as much as they loved order. To them, speech was power and silence was weakness. Though silence was often all that women and slaves were allowed by midday. The world shimmered again, and Athens seemed to slow down entirely. The marble columns of temples blazed white in the sun, blinding to look at, while the narrow alleys offered strips of shade where people huddled to escape the heat. Children splashed in shallow fountains, their laughter echoing off stone walls, while older men sat cross-legged in doorways, their eyes half closed in thought or exhaustion. Somewhere, a philosopher was lecturing to a small group of followers, his voice calm, his gestures slow, his arguments twisting through logic like vines around a pillar. He spoke of virtue, justice, and the nature of the soul, unaware, perhaps unconcerned, that most of his listeners were only half awake. For them, philosophy was both fascinating and fatiguing, a mental dance that made them forget, for a moment, how ordinary their lives really were. The afternoon dragged on, a test of endurance rather than energy. Laborers worked in fields or workshops, each movement deliberate, conserving strength. The smell of dust hung heavy, stirred only by the rare breath of wind from the sea. Water was fetched from communal fountains, each drop precious, carried home in heavy clay jars that left grooves on the shoulders of those who bore them. Food preparation began early, slow and repetitive. Grinding grain between stones, pressing olives, tending fires, all of it took hours. By the time the sun began to dip toward the horizon, everyone's muscles ached, and even the gods painted on the temple walls seemed to droop under the weight of the day. And yet, in this endless repetition, there was harmony, a rhythm of life that didn't ask for excitement, only endurance. Evening was when the city finally breathed. Smoke curled gently from chimneys as households gathered for their simple meals. There was talking, laughter, sometimes song, and always the crackle of fire in the hearth. For many, it was the only time of day that felt truly human. The men spoke of politics or trade, the women of family and chores. The children listened quietly, and the slaves hovered silently in the background. Every household carried its own small world, bound together by necessity more than affection. Outside, the city glowed softly under torchlight, the smell of oil lamps and cooked fish drifting through the streets. Travelers passed by, carrying goods or stories from distant lands. Sparta, Thebes, even Persia. People listened with quiet fascination, imagining worlds beyond their own dusty horizon. Those who could read sometimes recited short poems or passages from plays, their voices weaving through the warm night air like music. Night in ancient Greece was different from anything you know today. Without electricity, it was alive with sound and shadow. Crickets sang endlessly, dogs barked in the distance, and every whisper seemed amplified by the darkness. People feared the night, but also found peace in it. It was the time when thoughts could wander freely, when dreams of gods and glory mixed with the reality of aching bones and tired minds. If you looked up, the sky was impossibly vast, filled with stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. The Greeks believed those stars were stories, heroes, monsters, and gods frozen in time, and perhaps that belief made the darkness feel less empty. For the poor, sleep came quickly, heavy and dreamless. For the wealthy, it came later, after wine, music, and talk that stretched deep into the night. But in the end, everyone slept beneath the same sky, their dreams blending into one endless story of endurance. If you, a modern soul, found yourself there, you might first be enchanted. The glow of torchlight on marble, the sound of lyres drifting through the air, the scent of olive oil and sea salt. But enchantment would fade fast. You'd miss your soft bed, your shower, your quiet. You'd realize that every comfort you take for granted was once a dream too far, even for philosophers. You'd struggle with the noise, the heat, the slow rhythm of life that refuses to bend to your urgency. Ancient Greece was magnificent, yes, but it was also monotonous. The people found beauty in that monotony, while you might find only restlessness. Yet, as sleep pressed against your eyes, lulled by the steady hum of crickets and the faint rustle of the Aegean breeze, you'd begin to understand their secret, that boredom isn't an enemy, it's a mirror. In the silence of ancient life, you couldn't escape your own thoughts. And maybe that's what made their world both unbearable and wise. And so the day ended, as it always did, with no grand event, no climax, just the slow fading of light and the quiet promise that tomorrow would be the same. The fires dimmed, the streets emptied, and somewhere on the Acropolis, the last torch flickered out. The city slept beneath the gaze of its stone gods, timeless and still, waiting for another dawn to begin the same patient, ancient rhythm all over again. The world beyond Greece was vast, and though the Athenians believed themselves to be the center of civilization, the truth was that they were merely one chapter in the slow, dusty book of history that stretched far beyond the marble walls of their temples. As the centuries turned, other empires rose, built upon the same relentless cycle of labor, heat, and endurance. Ancient Egypt, for instance, seemed like a place of eternal mystery and divine grandeur. But if you ever found yourself standing along the banks of the Nile at dawn, you'd quickly realize that its beauty was built on monotony, sweat, and silence. The river, broad and calm, looked almost lazy, yet it was the heart that kept Egypt alive. Every year it flooded, spreading black silt across the farmlands. And when the waters receded, thousands of hands went to work planting grain under a sun that showed no mercy. From sunrise to sunset, farmers bent their backs to the earth, their hands cracked from labor, their eyes squinting against the light. There were no breaks, no variety, just the steady rhythm of survival that had existed since the dawn of time. Life depended on the river's mood. A good flood meant food, a bad one meant famine. Even the grand pharaohs, with their golden masks and eternal tombs, could not command the Nile. They might have ruled men, but the river ruled them all. For most Egyptians, life was a narrow line between work and faith. The gods were everywhere, blazing in the sky. Anubis watching over the dead, Isis guarding mothers and children. Every moment, from birth to burial, was tangled with ritual. But these rituals, though sacred, were also repetitive. And the people followed them not because they expected miracles, but because they feared disorder. To skip a prayer, to ignore a symbol, felt like inviting chaos itself. The temples were enormous and magnificent, carved with scenes that stretched on for miles. But imagine spending your days chiseling the same patterns into stone, day after day, for decades. You wouldn't see the temple finished in your lifetime. You might die still holding the same worn tool, your name forgotten, your work immortal. The irony was sharp. The builders of eternity lived short, ordinary lives, their sweat forever sealed into the monuments they would never enjoy. For the priests, life was cleaner, but not easier. They rose before dawn to wash, shave, and dress in linen, performing endless rituals meant to purify the body and please the gods. The chants echoed through the halls of temples, heavy with incense, their voices low and rhythmic, lulling the city into a trance. The desert beyond the Nile was vast and quiet, a land of endless sand and silence. The pyramids stood there like frozen thoughts, reminders that time itself could be shaped by human will. But if you approached one closely, you'd see not the magic of the movies, but the sheer exhaustion of engineering. Thousands of laborers, skilled and unskilled, worked beneath the sun, dragging stones heavier than belief. They sang to keep rhythm, to distract from pain, their songs blending with the sound of the wind. Each block, each step, each pull was another moment lost to history. You could almost hear the sighs of the workers echoing across centuries, the dull creak of ropes, the groan of stone on stone. And at night, when the stars burned over the desert like white fire, they would rest in the shadow of the monument they'd never enter. To live in ancient Egypt was to live knowing that greatness required your exhaustion, that the beauty of your world was built on your back, inside the cities. Life was slower, but no less demanding. Markets bustled under the open sun, selling grain, pottery, linen, and jewelry. The smell of baked bread and roasted duck mingled with the stench of sweat and mud from the riverbanks. People wore simple linen garments, light enough to survive the heat, and covered their heads with cloth or wigs to protect themselves from the sun. Hygiene mattered deeply, perhaps more than in any other ancient world. The Egyptians bathed often, rubbed oils into their skin, and used perfumes made from flowers and resins. But don't let that sound glamorous. Soap was made from animal fat and ash. Perfume came from grinding petals by hand. It was labor disguised as luxury. And beneath the surface of all this cleanliness lay the same truth that haunted every civilization: the fight against decay, against time, against the slow erosion of life itself. Religion guided everything. The afterlife wasn't a mystery, it was a destination, and everyone prepared for it, as if packing for a long journey. Tombs were built even for the humble, though small and plain, and each burial was a careful ceremony meant to ensure safe passage to the next world. But the process was long and strange to modern minds. The body was dried with salt, wrapped in linen, and filled with amulets meant to protect the soul. The wealthy were buried with treasures, the poor with prayers, and in every tomb, from the grandest pyramid to the smallest pit, there was the same silent hope that death would be easier than life. To live in ancient Egypt was to live with death always nearby, not as fear, but as familiarity. The line between the living and the dead was thin, like the horizon where sand met sky. As the sun fell and the desert cooled, the sound of frogs and insects filled the air. Families gathered by their small mud brick homes, the walls painted with simple colors, the floors swept smooth with palm brooms. They ate lentils, bread, onions, and fish, and shared stories that had been told for generations. The air smelled of smoke, clay, and river water. In the distance, priests still chanted, their voices carrying across the darkened fields, and above them the stars looked down unchanged. The same stars the Greeks and Persians would later watch, the same that we see today. Time moved differently in Egypt. It didn't rush forward, it circled, repeating itself endlessly, just like the floods of the Nile. To live there was to live inside eternity, where every day felt ancient even while it was happening. For you, a modern traveler dropped into that world. The first shock wouldn't be the heat or the silence, it would be the slowness. Everything took time. You'd wait hours to bake bread, days to fetch grain, weeks to travel anywhere. There were no shortcuts, no sudden bursts of progress, only patience. You'd quickly learn that boredom wasn't something to be escaped, but something to survive. And in that survival, you'd find a strange peace. The same river that fed the fields would cool your skin. The same sun that burned you would light the temple walls in gold at dusk. And the same stars that seemed endless would become your only measure of time. Ancient Egypt, like Greece, was beautiful not because it was exciting, but because it endured. Its people didn't chase novelty, they mastered repetition, and in doing so, they outlasted empires that came after. Long after the last stone of the pyramids was set in place, long after the songs of Egyptian laborers had faded into sand and silence, the world moved on, but not with the speed we know today. Civilization drifted slowly east and west, carried on the backs of traders, soldiers, and dreamers who barely knew what lay beyond the next hill. In Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates carved their paths through the land like veins of life, people lived by the same rhythm of repetition that ruled Egypt. The rivers flooded and receded, the fields yielded and failed, and the people prayed, recorded, and rebuilt. To us, ancient Mesopotamia sounds like the beginning of something great writing. Cities, laws, but to live there would have been to wake each morning in a world that never changed. The air smelled of wet earth and smoke. The streets were narrow and uneven. The houses built of sun-baked clay that cracked in the heat and dissolved in the rain. People patched their walls with the same mud they walked on, rebuilding year after year, knowing the rain would undo their labor again. The city of yore, once the jewel of Sumer, rose from this monotony, its ziggurat piercing the sky like a stairway to heaven. But for the thousands who carried bricks to build it, Heaven must have felt very far away. Each step they laid was another reminder of how small they were, how endless the work was, how heavy devotion could become when measured in clay and sweat inside the temples. Priests and scribes ruled more firmly than kings. They wrote on tablets of wet clay, pressing wedge-shaped marks that spoke of taxes, grain, births, and deaths. Most of what we know about Mesopotamia comes from these simple records, not from grand stories, but from lists of goods, lists of workers, lists of gods. It's strange to think that the first writing wasn't born from poetry or passion, but from accounting. Civilization began not with love, but with bookkeeping. If you were there, you'd see rows of scribes hunched over wooden benches, their fingers stained with clay, their eyes squinting in the dim light. They didn't imagine they were shaping history. They were just trying to keep track of who owed what. Outside, merchants bartered in the market, their voices sharp and rhythmic, shouting prices for barley, copper, and wool. Children chased stray goats through the alleys. Women carried jars of water balanced on their heads. Dogs barked, flies hummed. The sun baked everything in sight. It wasn't grand, it was ordinary. And yet, in that ordinariness, something remarkable was happening. Humanity was learning to organize time, to measure life, to record its own existence. But organization came with control. The first laws appeared, codes etched into stone, declaring who could own what, who could marry whom, and what price must be paid for breaking the rules. Hammurabi's code, carved into black basalt, stood tall in the city like a silent judge. An eye for an eye, it declared. And though those words sound harsh now, they were the first attempt to make justice predictable instead of personal. Still, for most people, life was less about law and more about endurance. A farmer in Mesopotamia didn't worry about philosophy. He worried about the weather. He watched the sky every morning for signs of rain, prayed to gods he'd never see, and worked until his back bent like the reeds by the river. He didn't dream of changing the world. He just hoped the river wouldn't flood too soon or dry too fast. His world was small, contained within the horizon, and his days passed in the quiet repetition that history often forgets at night. When the heat finally faded, the people gathered on rooftops to sleep under the stars. They told stories of gods who fought in the heavens, of monsters that swam beneath the rivers, of heroes who sought immortality. The epic of Gilgamesh was born from such nights, from the merging of myth and memory, from the longing of ordinary people for something greater than mud and mortality. But even those grand stories carried a melancholy weight. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, sought eternal life and found only the truth that nothing lasts. The moral was clear to every listener: you cannot escape the slow erosion of time. You can build, you can rule, you can love, but one day, all of it will return to dust. Perhaps that's why their stories were so full of gods and floods and second chances. Hope was their rebellion against inevitability. Beyond the rivers, other lands woke slowly. In the Indus Valley, cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro rose in orderly precision, their streets laid out in straight lines, their houses equipped with drains and wells that would not be seen again for centuries in the West. But these cities were quiet. Civilization's no records, no grand inscriptions, just the silent geometry of their planning. To walk there would feel almost eerie. The streets were clean, the walls smooth, the air heavy with the smell of damp clay and grain. People worked in workshops, shaping beads and pottery, while traders loaded boats with goods for distant lands. And yet we know so little about them. Their language, still undeciphered, sits like a whisper, lost to time. Imagine standing on one of those ancient streets, surrounded by order, but haunted by silence. Every brick seems to speak of discipline, of calm, of people who built not for glory, but for stability. But one day, without warning, it all ended. The cities emptied, the rivers shifted, the people vanished, leaving behind the echo of their quiet brilliance. If you were there in those last days, you wouldn't have noticed the end coming. There was no explosion, no war, just a slow fading. The water changed its course, the soil lost its strength, the trade routes moved, and life slipped away. That's how history often ends, not with drama, but with exhaustion. Civilizations die like old men, not in battle, but in sleep. And as the Indus faded, new centers rose: Babylon, Persia, the realms that would one day clash with Greece and Rome. Each new empire believed itself eternal, and each repeated the same pattern of rise and decay. They built walls, minted coins, carved monuments, wrote poems, and, in doing so, laid the foundation for their own eventual ruin. In Persia, vast and glittering, kings ruled from palaces adorned with gold and ivory. But even there, life for most was the same unending rhythm of dust and duty. Farmers plowed fields beneath mountains that never moved. Messengers carried letters along the royal road, running for days across deserts and plains. Soldiers stood guard at gates that saw no enemies for decades. The grandeur of empire was a thin layer over the same ancient truth. The human day is long and uneventful. You would have felt it to the endless sameness of sunrise and sunset. The feeling that the world was old and slow and indifferent to your existence. And yet, in that slowness, there was a strange beauty. Imagine standing on the walls of Babylon as night fell, the hanging gardens alive with green shadows and water trickling from terraces. The air would smell of jasmine and damp stone, and for a moment you might feel that the world truly had achieved perfection. But beneath those gardens, slaves carried water from the river, hour after hour, to feed the illusion. Their feet left grooves in the stone from years of walking the same path. History remembers the gardens. It forgets the labor. Every wonder of the world is built on that quiet imbalance, the few who dream and the many who endure. As centuries passed, the borders shifted again. Alexander came and went, leaving behind cities named after himself, his conquests brief but loud. Then came Rome, vast and restless, its legions stamping roads across continents. But even then, for the common person, little changed. The tools were different. The rulers had new names, but the rhythm remained the same. Work, eat, sleep, hope. To live in ancient times was to live in repetition. Time did not race, it crawled. Days bled into each other like ink on parchment, and even the greatest empires were just long pauses in the silence of eternity. So when you think of history as boring, you're not wrong. The past wasn't made of battles and discoveries, it was made of waiting. Waiting for the rain, waiting for the harvest, waiting for something different to happen that never did. The stories we remember are the exceptions. The rest was dust and patience. If you closed your eyes now and imagined yourself there, lying on a clay roof under a sky thick with stars, you might understand. The air is warm. The river hums in the distance. The city breathes slowly, and nothing, absolutely nothing, is happening. And somehow, that stillness feels infinite. The story of civilization drifted onward like the slow turning of a wheel. And by the time the old empires of the East had grown tired, new lands were stirring with their own quiet ambitions. Across the Mediterranean, the cities that would one day belong to Rome were still small, their people simple, their days governed by the same predictable sun and soil that ruled everywhere else. Yet, even as the centuries passed, nothing ever truly felt new. The tools changed shape, the languages evolved, the gods wore different names, but human life, the daily rhythm of hunger, hope, and habit, remained the same. To live in the world of the ancients was to live surrounded by repetition, the same cycle of building and breaking, of morning light and evening fire. And if you could somehow slip back into that world and stand among them, you'd find it strangely familiar in its slowness. You'd see the farmer in his field, the potter at his wheel, the scribe scratching lines on clay or papyrus, each one a silent thread in the endless fabric of history. No one there thought of themselves as ancient. They were simply alive, caught in the steady hum of existence, unaware that their ordinary days would someday be studied, romanticized, or forgotten entirely. To travel through that world would be to walk through stillness. The air carried the smell of smoke and sweat, of bread baking, of wool being washed in the river. In small towns, scattered along the Mediterranean coast, children ran barefoot through dust, chasing goats or throwing pebbles into the sea. Men sat beneath olive trees and argued about taxes or weather, while women wove cloth, their hands moving with mechanical grace, their thoughts lost somewhere between memory and necessity. The evenings were long, filled with soft conversation and the flicker of firelight against the walls of stone houses. There was no rush, because there could be no rush. Everything took the time it took. The harvest came when it came. The storms arrived when they pleased, and the sea granted or denied its gifts without reason. The people didn't fight this rhythm, they belonged to it. Life wasn't a race, it was a circle. And within that circle, generations came and went, leaving behind traces so faint that only archaeologists would one day piece them together and call it history. In places like Anatolia and the Levant, trade linked the world long before the word global had any meaning. Caravans moved slowly across the landscape, camels swaying under the weight of copper, spices, and wool. Traders carried small amulets for luck, whispered prayers before crossing deserts, and counted the stars to find their way. Each journey was a gamble. Sandstorms, bandits, or illness could end it before it began. But for those who survived, there was a strange satisfaction in the journey itself. Nights were spent around campfires, the flames flickering against weathered faces, the same songs sung in different tongues. There were no borders then, only distances, vast stretches of silence, broken by the occasional oasis or ruined temple standing alone against the sky. If you were to walk with them, you'd feel time stretching. each day indistinguishable from the last, until the concept of a future lost its meaning. The ancients didn't dream of tomorrow the way we do. They survived today and called that enough. As the centuries unfolded, power gathered once again into empires. The Persians rose to rule half the known world, their roads connecting cities across thousands of miles, their messengers galloping from Susa to Sardis in a matter of days. But even this marvel of organization, this heartbeat of empire, was just another form of monotony for those who lived within it. The royal couriers carried scrolls they could not read, slept in stables between stations, and saw the same landscape pass endlessly, the same dust, the same horizon. The soldiers who guarded the roads sharpened their spears and waited for wars that might never come. The farmers in the valleys below tilled their land, unbothered by politics or conquest, because whether the banner above the fortress bore the lion of Persia or the eagle of Greece, the soil didn't care. History's great shifts, the ones that fill our books, rarely touched the lives of those who actually lived through them. For most, life remained what it had always been, a long, slow negotiation with hunger and weather, punctuated only by small joys: a child's laughter, a shared meal, a good harvest. Even in Greece, the cradle of philosophy and art, the days were longer and duller than legend suggests. The thinkers we celebrate, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, were rare minds in a sea of fishermen, farmers, and merchants who spent their lives working, not wondering. The agora, that symbol of democracy and debate, smelled of sweat, oil, and fish. People argued not about ideals, but about prices. A philosopher might speak to a small crowd, his words lost amid the chatter of market stalls and the braying of donkeys. His thoughts on virtue and reason would live for millennia, but in that moment, he was just another man in the sun, speaking to people who had no time for ideas when there was bread to buy and taxes to pay. Yet even that ordinariness had its own kind of nobility. These were people who lived close to the earth, who understood the seasons better than the stars, who built their lives not on dreams but on endurance. Their stories were never written, but without them, the world of marble temples and heroic myths would have had no foundation at all. The Romans, when they came, promised order and progress, but what they really offered was a new version of the same old pattern. The empire stretched from the cold edges of Britain to the deserts of Arabia, and still the rhythm of life remained unchanged. The farmer in Gaul and the merchant in Syria lived parallel lives, bound by the same calendar of toil. The Romans were masters of repetition, of roads that stretched straight and unending, of aqueducts that carried the same water day after day, of legions that marched in perfect rhythm to the beat of drums. Discipline was their religion, and it made them powerful, but it also made their world mechanical. You can almost hear it: the constant tramp of boots, the clink of armor, the echo of commands shouted across stone courtyards. For the common Roman, the grandeur of empire was a distant rumor. What mattered was the next meal, the next tax, the next harvest. The senators debated in marble halls, but the people listened to the gossip of the marketplace, their lives unchanged by the words of emperors. Still, Rome's shadow touched everything. Its cities were noisy and crowded, filled with the smell of cooking, sewage, and sweat. The streets were alive with beggars, traders, and entertainers. gladiators fought not for glory, but for survival. Slaves built monuments they would never enter. The amphitheaters roared with excitement. Yet, beneath that noise lay exhaustion, the weariness of a people who had turned spectacle into escape. Outside the city walls, farmers watched the same sunrise that had risen over Greece and Egypt and Mesopotamia, and they must have wondered whether anything in the world truly changed. History advanced in the eyes of the few, but for the many, it simply repeated itself in different clothes. When night came, the fires burned low, and the city softened. You could walk along the Tiber and see the reflection of torches in the water. Hear the distant hum of conversation, the faint cry of a baby from some upper window. And if you listened carefully, beyond the laughter and the noise, you'd hear something deeper, kind of stillness, as if the entire city were holding its breath. That stillness is what binds every civilization together, the quiet heartbeat beneath the noise of history. It is the sound of time itself, slow, patient, indifferent. The Romans might have believed their empire would last forever, but eternity has always belonged to silence. When Rome finally fell, it didn't crumble in a single day of chaos and flame. It faded the way all things fade, gradually, gently, as though it were simply going to sleep. And that is the strange comfort of boring history. Beneath the wars, the inventions, and the empire's lies a truth that never changes. Humanity's greatest achievement is survival. The world turns, the rivers shift, the kings come and go, but the ordinary heartbeat of life endures. It's easy to romanticize the past, to imagine marble columns and golden crowns. But the real history, the one that actually existed, was made of dust, of patience, of long hours and quiet nights. It was made by people who lived and died without ever knowing they were part of something vast. They didn't need to. For them, existence itself was enough. And maybe as you drift towards sleep, listening to this endless rhythm of human endurance, you'll understand what they knew so well, that the world doesn't need to be exciting to be meaningful. Sometimes the dullness of life is what gives it its shape, its peace, its strange, eternal beauty. When the echoes of Rome faded into the mist of forgotten centuries, the world did not suddenly awaken into something new. It merely turned over, sighing in its sleep, and continued its slow rhythm of existence. The centuries that followed were not filled with the noise of constant invention, as we like to imagine, but with the quiet persistence of survival. Fields were still plowed, bread was still baked, and fires still burned against the night. The fall of an empire didn't mean the fall of life. It only meant that power had changed hands, names had changed languages, and the same human routines had found new places to repeat themselves. In the ruins of Roman roads, grass grew thick and green. Travelers still walked along them, unaware they were stepping on history. The great aqueducts that had once carried the lifeblood of a city now stood dry, their stones warm in the afternoon sun, as birds nested where water once flowed. It was a world that had grown older, but not wiser, quieter, but no less alive. To live in the early medieval centuries was to wake each day into a life that felt endless, where change came so slowly it was almost invisible. And the seasons repeated themselves like verses in an ancient song that everyone knew but no one remembered learning. In small villages scattered across what had once been the Roman world, People rose with the first light of dawn. The air smelled of smoke, hay, and damp earth. There were no clocks, no rush, no alarms, only the steady rhythm of nature to guide them. Men went to the fields with wooden plows and tired oxen, their bodies already hardened by years of labor before they were 30. Women tended fires, kneaded bread, and nursed children, their hands calloused yet capable, their lives bound to the same narrow piece of land for as long as memory stretched. The church bell, when it rang, was not just a call to prayer, was the heartbeat of the entire community. Time itself was measured by its tolling. The morning mass, the midday angelus, the evening vesper. The sound echoed through the fog and over the fields, soft and solemn, reminding everyone that no matter how hard life was, it had a rhythm, and rhythm meant order. Even boredom had a kind of peace to it. The Middle Ages are often imagined as darker, time of ignorance and superstition, but for those who lived through them, life wasn't darkness. It was simply dim, lit by candles and patience. The nights were long, and the stars were the only clock most people could afford. Inside cottages of mud and thatch, families huddled near the hearth, the smoke curling through the cracks in the roof, the walls covered in soot. Stories passed from mouth to mouth, legends of saints and spirits that lived in the forests or watched from the skies. People didn't separate myth from truth. Both were part of the same world, the same invisible web that held everything together. They worked because the earth demanded it, prayed because the heavens might notice, and slept because there was nothing else to do once the sun went down. In the silence of those nights, you could hear the world breathing wind through the trees, water over stones, the low murmur of livestock, and it felt eternal beyond the villages. Forests stretched for miles, deep and endless, filled with sounds that never changed, the rustle of leaves, the crack of branches, the distant howl of wolves. Traveling through them was slow and dangerous, not because of monsters, but because of solitude. Roads were few, and most were just muddy paths that vanished into the fog. A traveler might walk for days without seeing another soul, surviving on bread, berries, and luck. When he finally reached a monastery or town, the sight of smoke rising from chimneys must have felt like a miracle. And yet, even towns were quiet things. Stone walls surrounded wooden houses. Markets bustled only once a week. And when night fell, everything closed, as though the world itself had gone to sleep. Candles flickered in windows, the smell of wax and tallow thick in the air, and the streets emptied except for stray dogs and the watchman making his rounds with a lantern. There was no noise of carriages, no hum of machinery, no rush of life, only the stillness of waiting. The monasteries were the closest things to centers of knowledge. But even there, time moved at the speed of ink drying on parchment. Monks rose before dawn, prayed, worked, and wrote. Their days were measured not in excitement, but in repetition. The scratching of quills was the soundtrack of their lives, the scent of ink and vellum their constant companions. Every letter they wrote was a small act of defiance against forgetting, a way to preserve the world in words while everything outside decayed in mud and rain. If you could stand in one of those scriptoria, you'd hear the steady rhythm of labor, the turning of pages, the muttered prayers, the faint crackle of candles burning low. The monks didn't imagine they were shaping the future. They were simply continuing what had to be continued, keeping the flame of knowledge alive in a world that had little use for it. And perhaps that was their greatness, not brilliance, but persistence. Outside the cloisters, the land belonged to the lords, but power in those days was fragile. Castles, though imposing, were mostly stone shells, surrounded by farms and fear. A peasant's life was defined by obedience to the seasons, to the soil, to the will of those who ruled from towers they rarely left. Taxes were paid in grain, service, or silence. To resist was not rebellion, it was suicide. Yet there was a strange comfort in the certainty of it all. Everyone knew their place, their purpose, their prayers. The Lord ruled, the priest blessed, the peasant worked, and the wheel kept turning. The simplicity was heavy, yes, but it was also stable. The world might have seemed motionless, but it did not fall apart. And in that stillness, the people found meaning in small things: the warmth of bread, the laughter of children, the color of dawn after a storm. Seasons marked the only true progress. Spring brought muddy fields and aching backs. Summer burned skin and ripened crops. Autumn filled granaries and hearts with relief. Winter tested everything. When the snow fell, the world shrank to the size of a hearth. Families gathered close, sharing what little they had, telling stories that blurred the line between history and hope. The wind howled outside, but inside, life continued its slow hum. And in that hum, there was peace born not of comfort, but of acceptance. Life was short, hard, and often dull, but it was theirs. They didn't dream of conquering the stars or unlocking the secrets of the universe. They dreamed of spring, of enough food, of mercy. The centuries rolled by in this slow rhythm. Kings came and went, wars flared and faded, but for the common person, little changed. The plow was still the same shape, the bread still baked in the same fire, the prayers still whispered in the same language. Even as cathedrals rose and knights rode across Europe, the true life of the world remained quiet. The Gothic arches and stained glass that dazzled the eyes of the few were built by the hands of the many, who worked from sunrise to sunset without ever seeing their creation completed. To be a stonemason in those times was to know that your masterpiece would outlive you by centuries, and yet you'd never see it finished. Each strike of your hammer was an act of faith, a belief that what you built mattered, even if no one remembered your name. And perhaps that is the heart of boring history, the countless invisible lives that kept the world from falling apart. The monks who copied books they would never read, the peasants who fed kings they would never meet, the builders who raised walls they would never walk within, all of them living small, quiet lives that made greatness possible. The modern mind might find their existence unbearable, but theirs was a patience we have forgotten. They understood that time was not to be conquered, but endured. And maybe, as you drift deeper into this slow world of candlelight and silence, you can hear it to the rhythm of centuries, steady and endless, like the breathing of the earth itself. If you could fall asleep beneath the shadow of a medieval cathedral, you would hear not the prayers of saints, but the hum of time itself, slow and patient, like rain falling on old stone. Life in the Middle Ages was not a rush of events. It was a long, unbroken breath that stretched across generations. The world moved with the patience of a tree growing in silence. People did not count their days by minutes or seconds, but by seasons, harvests, and births. To live then was to live inside time rather than against it, to accept its weight, its rhythm, its indifference. Even kings, for all their crowns and banners, could not escape this slow order. Their reigns, written in gold on parchment, still depended on the same rain that fed a peasant's field, the same sun that bleached a monk's manuscript. Everyone belonged to the same clock, a clock wound by nature and unwound by death. The boredom of that era was not emptiness, it was a kind of surrender, a calm acknowledgement that life was not a race but a circle, always returning to where it began, inside castles, where stone walls trapped both luxury and cold. Noble life was less glamorous than legend suggests. The air smelled of smoke and damp wool, the sound of footsteps echoing endlessly across stone floors. Torches flickered against walls, hung with faded tapestries depicting wars and hunts no one remembered clearly. Servants moved quietly, their faces expressionless, carrying trays of bread and ale. Even the lords, seated beside great hearths, often stared into the fire as though searching for meaning in the flames. Entertainment came in measured doses, a troubadour singing a song of impossible love, a jester spinning a joke already old, a falcon returning from the sky with a rabbit in its claws. Outside, the wind howled through the towers, and inside, time stood still. A noble might spend an entire evening listening to a single harp song or discussing with his steward how many sacks of grain had spoiled in the damp cellar. For all their wealth, they too were trapped in the slow machinery of medieval life. They had more food, more furs, more space, but not more hours. For the majority who lived beyond those walls, time was harsher and more honest. Peasants rose before the sun, their bodies shaped by labor, their faces burned by wind and work. The tools they used were simple: wooden plows, iron sickles, hands that knew no rest. A man might spend his entire life cultivating the same few acres of soil, his son taking over after him, his grandson after that, and still the land would look the same. It was not progress, it was persistence. There were no inventions to lighten the load, no machines to save strength. The only miracle was endurance. Evenings were spent by firelight, patching clothes, mending tools, or simply staring at the flames. In the background, the same lullaby of frogs, crickets, and distant dogs played every night for centuries. The boredom of such a life was profound, but within that stillness was something sacred, the quiet certainty that life went on. Religion colored every breath of existence. The church was not just a building. It was the spine of medieval society, its rituals, the heartbeat of every day. Sunday Mass, baptism, confession, marriage, burial, each moment of life began and ended under the watchful eyes of the church. Even when no priest was present, people lived by its rhythm. The bells rang across fields, calling laborers to prayer, marking the hours of light and dark. Pilgrims trudged along muddy roads toward distant holy places, their feet blistered, their hearts full of quiet hope. Monks chanted in cloisters, where sunlight filtered through stained glass, turning dust motes into tiny floating worlds. The language of the church Latin was a mystery to most, but its sound, the melody of faith, mattered more than its meaning. For a peasant kneeling in a cold chapel, listening to the droning of a priest he couldn't understand. There was still comfort in knowing that heaven, at least, followed an order, even if earth did not. But faith could also be fear. Disease, famine, and war came without warning, and people explained them as the wrath of God. When the Black Death swept across Europe in the 14th century, it carried silence with it. Villages emptied, bells tolled endlessly, and carts filled with bodies creaked through narrow streets. Yet even amid such horror, life resumed its rhythm once the dead were buried. The survivors went back to their plows, their prayers, their small hopes. The world had changed, but daily life remained stubbornly the same. That, perhaps, was the truest sign of the age's refusal to hurry, its resilience in the face of everything. Even plague could not break the monotony of the human heartbeat in towns and cities. Markets became small islands of motion in the sea of stillness. The sound of traders shouting prices, the scent of fish and spices, the clatter of horseshoes on cobblestones, all of it felt alive, chaotic, and precious. Yet even there, time was slow. A man selling wool might stand in the same stall for 40 years, his son taking over after him. The goods changed hands, but the rhythm of barter remained the same. The air buzzed with gossip, with rumors from distant lands of crusades, of new kings, of strange animals in Africa. But such stories felt more like dreams than reality. For most people, the edge of the known world ended a few miles from where they were born. To travel beyond that was to vanish into myth. Maps were more imagination than science, filled with dragons, saints, and seas no one had seen. Yet the unknown did not trouble them. They had enough mystery in their own backyard: the turning of the seasons, the growing of wheat, the slow decay of time itself. The passing of years was visible everywhere, in the crumbling edges of walls, in the moss that crept across gravestones, in the faces of the old. Aging was not an enemy, but a fact. Wrinkles were not fought, but accepted. Strength faded like daylight. Children grew into adults, adults into ancestors. Cemeteries lay beside churches, so that every mass was also a reminder of death's patience. Life and death were not opposites, but neighbors. A newborn might be baptized in the same water that had washed a corpse the week before. To modern eyes, it seems grim. To them, it was balance. Death was not a tragedy, it was punctuation. And yet, for all this slowness, there was beauty everywhere. The sky at dusk turned the same deep blue over castles and cottages alike. Fields glowed gold under the harvest sun. Rivers carried reflections of clouds that had seen centuries come and go. People knew beauty differently, not as something to capture or own, but as something to witness and let pass. A flower in bloom, a bird's song at dawn, the laughter of a child, these were enough. When you live in a world without rush, every small moment becomes infinite. Art, when it appeared, was not for pleasure, but for devotion. The painter's brush was guided by prayer, the sculptor's chisel by reverence. Cathedrals rose, not out of ambition, but faith. Each stone a word in a silent hymn. Builders worked for decades, never seeing the roof completed, yet they built with joy. The glassmakers crafted windows that caught the sun like frozen rainbows, painting the walls with holy light. Inside those cathedrals, the air seemed to hum with stillness. You could hear your own heartbeat against the echo of centuries. If boredom is the absence of movement, then perhaps that was the purest boredom of Aldovine, peaceful, eternal. The medieval world did not fear silence as we do. It was full of it. Between the tolling of bells, there were long stretches where nothing happened and no one expected it to. That was life, steady, slow, and circular. There was time to think, time to rest, time to exist. They didn't rush toward purpose because purpose was already everywhere. The modern mind might call that stagnation. The medieval heart called it grace. To live without hurry was not a failure. It was a form of faith, a trust that tomorrow would look like today, and that was enough. When night came, darkness returned like an ocean tide. Candles flickered, fires dimmed, and the stars took over the sky. Roads vanished into blackness, and the world shrank to the glow of a single flame. Families gathered around the hearth, their faces half lit, their voices soft. Stories filled the air, some true, most imagined, but all told with the same calm certainty. There was no entertainment beyond words, no distraction beyond the warmth of each other's company. Children fell asleep, listening to tales of knights and dragons, of saints and miracles, never knowing where truth ended and dreams began. And perhaps it didn't matter. In a world that moved so slowly, imagination was the only thing fast enough to travel. So, if you close your eyes now and drift back into that quiet century, you might find yourself sitting in that same circle of light, feeling the heat of the fire, hearing the gentle crackle of logs, the soft breathing of those around you. Outside, the wind whispers through the thatch, the moon climbs behind clouds, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell marks the hour, though no one knows which one. Time has folded into itself, soft and endless. Nothing is urgent. Nothing is lost. Everything simply is. If you were to stand on a hill overlooking the medieval countryside at dawn, you would see a world that seemed frozen in an eternal morning. The mist curling through valleys, the faint glow of the sun barely touching the tops of thatched roofs, and the sound of a distant bell announcing another day that would be almost exactly like the one before. The charm and weariness of those centuries lay in their sameness. The human story repeated itself, endlessly: birth, toil, prayer, death, and in that repetition, people found the strange peace of predictability. It was not a time of grand surprises or constant novelty. It was a slow unfolding of existence, where each breath belonged to a rhythm older than memory. The roads winding through the fields were ancient scars on the earth, made by countless feet that had walked them before and would walk them again, their purpose never questioned. In the stillness of the morning, the smoke rising from cottages looked like the size of a world that had learned to live with its own quietness. A day in that world began with labor and ended with exhaustion. And yet, between those two anchors, there was a deep intimacy with time itself. People knew the hours by the tilt of the sun, the way the shadows stretched across the soil, the smell of baking bread, the sound of roosters, or the toll of distant bells. No one rushed. Rushing was meaningless when the harvest came only once a year, when the rain decided everything, when the seasons could not be persuaded to move faster. The earth's pace was the only pace that mattered. Men bent their backs over plows. Women washed linen in streams that mirrored the gray sky and children learned early that life was not to be fought. The idea of ambition, as we understand it now, barely existed. Survival was achievement enough. The simplicity of it might feel suffocating to modern eyes, but there was a strange freedom in its predictability. Knowledge that tomorrow would not betray you by being too different from today. Villages were small constellations of wood and stone surrounded by endless green, each house a universe of its own, filled with the same smells of hay, smoke, and bread. The fields stretched beyond sight, their boundaries marked by hedges or streams rather than fences. Chickens clucked near doorways, pigs rooted in the mud, and dogs lay curled in the sun. In the evenings, the light turned honey-colored, falling softly on everything it touched, and for a brief moment, the world seemed almost kind. Neighbors gathered to share food or stories, their laughter muffled by the wind. There was little privacy, but there was connection, the kind that comes from shared endurance. Life was communal, not because it was fashionable, but because solitude was dangerous. One person's sickness, one bad harvest, one stray spark in a barn could undo everyone. Dependence wasn't weakness, it was survival. The church tower stood above all, not because it was grand, but because it was constant. Its bell marked the day's rhythm, its shadow moved with the sun, and its walls held the memories of every life that had passed through the village. Inside, the air was cool and heavy with incense. The flicker of candles illuminated faces lined with reverence or fear, and the Latin chants rose and fell like waves against the stone. Most people didn't understand the words, but they understood the feeling, the promise that their small lives mattered in the grand design of heaven. Even the illiterate had a relationship with eternity, carved into the rhythm of their prayers. On feast days, the churchyard filled with color-bright fabrics, laughter, and music played on simple instruments. For a few hours, the monotony of existence broke open, and joy spilled out like light through a cracked wall. Then, as the sun set, the joy folded itself away again, and the people returned to their quiet cycles of work and rest. The seasons were both tyrant and friend. Spring brought the trembling of new life, the first shoots pushing through the thawed soil, the return of color after months of gray. Summer was labor and sweat, fields buzzing with insects, the smell of ripe grain thick in the air. Autumn was gratitude and anxiety, the harvest both blessing and reminder that winter was coming. And winter cold, long, unrelenting, tested the patience of the soul. The nights stretched endlessly. The days barely broke the darkness. Food ran low, fires burned small, and time itself seemed to freeze. But even then, people endured. They patched clothes, told stories, sang hymns in cracked voices, and waited for the first hint of thaw. The rhythm was eternal: struggle, rest, repeat. And in that endless cycle, there was something strangely soothing, like the heartbeat of the world itself. To live in such an age was to be intimate with both silence and sound. The silence of fields stretching into fog, the silence of prayer whispered in the dark, the silence of snow falling on roofs, but also the sounds that broke it, the ring of a hammer on iron, the laughter of children chasing a chicken, the creak of wagon wheels on frozen mud, the moan of wind through the forest. The balance of noise and quiet made up the song of life. No one thought of it as romantic. It was simply the way things were. The boredom that defined those centuries was not numbness, it was endurance refined into art. People had learned to live with the long pause between moments, to find meaning in the waiting. Even the great events of history, the wars, the crusades, the plagues, barely touched the rhythm of the common person's day. Armies marched, kings died, cities burned, and yet the fields still needed plowing. The cows still needed milking. The bread still needed baking. The continuity of ordinary life outlasted the chaos of empires. To the historian, the Middle Ages were an age of upheaval. To the peasant, they were just another day under the same sky. That was the quiet miracle of the time, its ability to endure everything without changing much at all. 1,000 years passed like a single slow breath, and when it was over, the world looked almost the same. The boredom that modern people would call unbearable was, to them, a form of stability. In a world without distraction, attention was deeper. The flicker of a candle was entertainment enough. The sound of rain on a roof could hold you captive. People watched the sky, the fields, each other, the slow dance of shadows across walls. They noticed things we no longer see: the texture of bark, the smell of wet earth, the color of dawn before the sun truly rose. Their minds moved slower, perhaps, but their senses were sharper. To live without noise was to hear everything. Evenings were the gentlest time of all. After the work was done, after the animals were fed and the tools put away, families gathered by the fire. The flames painted their faces gold and red, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and stew. The conversation was simple: how the crops were growing, who was ill, what dreams someone had. And then came the stories, old as the stars, tales of saints who tamed beasts, of spirits that wandered the forest, of love lost and found, of heroes who never lived but never died either. Each story was a bridge between generations, passed down not through writing but through memory. In those moments, the villagers were not just surviving, they were remembering that they existed within a larger story. Even if they didn't know who wrote it, sleep came early, not out of choice, but necessity. Darkness was absolute, and candles were precious. As the fire dimmed, the house filled with the sounds of rest, soft breathing, the shifting of straw beds, the faint crackle of dying embers. Outside, the stars stretched endlessly, and the moon watched over a world at peace with its own slowness. Dreams, when they came, were simple and unhurried. A good harvest, a healthy child, a spring without frost. The world did not offer ambition, it offered continuity. And perhaps that was its quiet wisdom, to teach people that enough could be enough. When you think of that time now, it might seem suffocating, a world too small for modern dreams. But there was something sacred in its stillness. The boredom of the Middle Ages was not a flaw, it was a kind of faith. Faith that the sun would rise again, that the earth would yield, that life would go on no matter what. People did not fill their days with noise to escape themselves. They faced the silence and called it living. They found meaning in repetition, beauty in patience, and peace in the things that did not change. To live in such a world was to belong to time, not to chase it. And so, as you drift through this history of stillness, let the slowness settle in your bones. Imagine the smell of wood smoke, the sound of distant bells, the weight of a wool blanket in the cold. Imagine the steady heartbeat of a world that never hurried and never broke. The centuries hum like a lullaby, the same soft tune that has echoed since the first plow touched earth. Nothing rushes, nothing ends. Everything, even now, continues in the quiet rhythm of that ancient world. As the centuries turned and the medieval dawn slowly gave way to what we now call the early modern age, the world did not awaken suddenly, as if from a dream, merely blinked, stretched, and continued its slow, measured breathing. The fields were still there. The villages still whispered with the same voices. The bells still tolled through the same morning mist. And yet something subtle had begun to shift beneath the stillness, like the faint movement of roots under frozen soil. The Renaissance, though later celebrated as a burst of light after 1,000 years of shadow, did not arrive in fireworks or music. It crept quietly through ink-stained hands, the hum of workshops, and the turning of dusty pages in forgotten monasteries. It began with the curiosity of a few who dared to look beyond the horizon of tradition, who asked questions too small to be dangerous and too persistent to be ignored. But even as new ideas flickered to life, most of the world remained wrapped in its long, slow rhythm, too absorbed in survival to notice that history itself was changing its tone. In Italy, where the ruins of Rome still haunted the landscape, the first stirrings of this new age took shape. In Florence, Venice, and Milan, merchants counted coins with the same devotion that monks once counted prayers. Wealth began to shift from noble blood to clever hands, and art began to bloom in the cracks of commerce. Painters, sculptors, and thinkers found patrons who valued imagination as much as land. The city streets echoed with languages of trade, of art, of ambition, and yet beneath the noise, the rhythm of life was still the same heartbeat as it had always been. A painter like Leonardo da Vinci, sitting before his easel, might mix pigments with the same patience. The tools had changed, but the silence of concentration had not. When he painted the mysterious smile of the Mona Lisa, he was not capturing progress. He was capturing stillness, the quiet soul of a world that moved too slowly to realize it was being reborn. Meanwhile, in the north, the printing press began its slow revolution, not with thunder, but with the steady creak of wooden presses and the smell of ink drying on new paper. Books, once rare as relics, began to multiply like seeds in spring. Knowledge spread, but at first it walked rather than ran. A book could take months to reach another city and years to reach another language. Still, each page carried a spark. People began to read, not just to pray, but to think, to wonder, to question. The church bells still marked the hours, but now another rhythm joined them, the rhythmic clatter of presses, the slow birth of printed words. Yet even as knowledge expanded, life in the villages remained largely unchanged. A peasant who could not read would still wake before dawn, plow the same soil, and live by the same seasons. The Renaissance belonged to the cities, but the countryside remained caught in the timeless slumber of its own history. The same wind that carried the scent of paint and ink in Florence carried the smell of bread and manure in France, Germany, and England. The same sun that shone on Michelangelo's marble shone on shepherds tending their flocks. To those who lived in the shadows of change, history was invisible. The philosophers might debate the nature of man, But the farmer's hands were still blistered from the same work his ancestors had done for 1,000 years. The gulf between the dreamers and the doers widened, though neither side knew it yet. The Renaissance was not a dawn for all it was a candle lit in a few rooms, while the rest of the world slept peacefully in darkness, dreaming the same slow dream. Yet the air was changing in ways too quiet to be measured. In universities and taverns alike, men began to argue about the stars, the earth, and the gods. Copernicus looked to the heavens and dared to whisper that the sun, not the earth, was the center of it all. It was an idea both terrifying and beautiful, a single thought that could tilt the universe itself. But even that revelation took years to travel, carried not by trumpets but by manuscripts, by cautious conversation. To most, it meant nothing. The fields still needed plowing, the cows still needed milking, and the stars still rose and fell in the same eternal order. The vastness of discovery was felt only by a few, while the rest of the world turned its face toward the soil and slept soundly beneath the same sky that science was quietly redrawing the sea. Two began to whisper to restless men. Sailors, merchants, and dreamers looked toward the horizon and saw possibility. Ships set out from Portugal and Spain, their sails heavy with ambition and fear. The maps of the world stretched wider with every voyage, though each discovery was written over the bones of those who did not return. The so-called age of exploration was, in truth, an age of endurance, months of silence, broken only by the creak of ropes and the cry of gulls. Men huddled under the vastness of sky and ocean. To those on the ships, the world felt endless and empty, a monotonous expanse of blue. They must have wondered, as the days blurred into one another, whether adventure was truly the opposite of boredom or just another form of it. When they finally reached distant shores, the rhythm of life continued there, to new lands, new people, new labors, but the same sun rising and setting with unshakable patience. And while explorers charted the world, reformers began to chart the soul. Martin Luther, hammering his theses to a church door in Wittenberg, did not think of himself as creating revolution. He was simply tired of the noise of corruption and longed for silence, the silence of truth, unadorned and honest. Yet his hammer struck like thunder, and ripples spread across Europe. Churches divided, wars ignited, and for the first time in centuries, faith itself became a battlefield. Still, even as ideas and armies clashed, most of the world remained as it was. Farmers praying in small chapels, mothers singing to children by firelight, monks tending gardens. The noise of history always sounds loudest in hindsight. To those who lived it, it was often just another day in England. The slow rhythm of medieval life began to shift with strange new instruments, the spinning wheel, the loom, the first stirrings of the industries that would one day change everything. But for now, the changes were like ripples on still water. The peasants who wove wool for merchants did not yet know that they were standing at the edge of an age that would one day roar. The hum of spinning wheels joined the chorus of bells and birds, and time continued its patient march. The boredom of the past lingered, though it was beginning to thin, like fog at sunrise. The world was waking, but it had not yet opened its eyes fully. In great halls, where kings and queens dined beneath chandeliers of wax, The same old rituals played out with slightly newer costumes. Music filled the air flutes, lutes, voices raised in harmony but beneath the elegance. There was the same yearning for permanence, the same need to make time slow down. The art of the Renaissance was not just beauty, it was defiance. Every brushstroke, every statue, every dome was a way of saying, "Let this moment last forever." And for a time, it did. Even now, centuries later, their stillness holds us. The gaze of a painted face, the silence of marble figures, the frozen music of architectural reminders that even in the pursuit of progress, humanity never stopped longing for the quiet certainty of the past. But not all beauty was peaceful. Beneath the surface of art and thought, Europe was beginning to tremble. Empires grew restless, merchants hungered for more, and the gentle boredom of the medieval world gave way to ambition. Yet ambition, too, has its monotony. The wars of religion, the politics of kings, the endless treaties and betrayals, all were cycles of their own. The pattern had not broken. It had only changed its costume. History's slow rhythm continued to beat beneath the noise. If you were to walk through a Renaissance city at dusk, you might hear the sound of cobblestones underfoot, the call of merchants closing their stalls, the faint strains of music from a tavern, and the tolling of bells marking vespers. The air would smell of bread, wax, and river water. In a window above, a scholar might be reading by candlelight, his eyes tracing the printed words of Aristotle or Plato. He would not know that he was standing at the edge of a new world. To him, he was simply reading, thinking, existing. Progress rarely feels like progress when you're living it. It feels like the same slow day, the same heartbeat of centuries. And perhaps that is the truth of this so-called rebirth. The Renaissance was not a sudden awakening, but a continuation, a new verse in the same long song. The world did not race forward. It merely changed the tune. Beneath the brushstrokes of art and the words of philosophers, beneath the sails of explorers and the sermons of reformers, life remained the same quiet struggle to endure, to find meaning in repetition. The boredom of the past was not erased. It was refined. Even in the brilliance of the Renaissance, humanity's oldest rhythm still whispered beneath the noise. Breathe, work, rest, repeat. By the time the 16th century had ripened into the 17th, the hum of the Renaissance had softened into something quieter and stranger. The excitement of rediscovery had settled, like dust after a storm, and Europe found itself standing between two worlds, one foot still in the comforting soil of the old, the other hesitating over the threshold of the new. The Renaissance had taught mankind to question, to look beyond dogma, but it had also exhausted its appetite for wonder. What came next was not a burst of energy, but a long, deep breath, as if the world itself were pausing to think. The great cathedrals were already built. The artists had already painted their gods and saints. The philosophers had already debated the heavens. What remained now was the slow work of understanding the consequences of curiosity. The so-called age of reason was dawning, but even reason has its monotony. For every spark of discovery, there was an ocean of repetition. For every great thinker, thousands still woke, worked, and slept beneath the same unchanging sky. History, though it appeared to quicken, continued its ancient rhythm, stretching itself across time like a sigh dot in the villages of Europe. Life remained almost indistinguishable from what it had been centuries before. The seasons ruled everything, and the same rituals marked their passing: sowing, reaping, praying, waiting. People still measured time not in minutes but in harvests. The idea of science, of invention, of progress was something that existed far away, whispered about by those who lived in cities. People whose names peasants would never hear. And yet small things began to shift. Iron tools improved, roads became more reliable, and the rhythm of trade quickened. But even these changes felt less like revolution and more like subtle ripples on the still surface of a pond. You could live your entire life then without ever realizing that the world was on the verge of transforming itself. You could die in the same village you were born in, and history would pass you by like a distant echo. Meanwhile, in the cities, the murmur of learning grew louder. In coffee houses and salons, men and women gathered to talk about things: invisible atoms, planets, gravity, reason. A new kind of boredom was born, the fatigue of thinking too much. Galileo, peering through his telescope at the moon's uneven face, must have felt the same mix of awe and exhaustion that every scientist feels when discovery meets disbelief. His findings were as slow to spread as the stars were distant. Letters had to be carried, books had to be printed, minds had to be persuaded. Progress in those days was not a race, was a crawl. Even the greatest revolutions in thought began as whispers, as fragile as candle flames in the wind. When Galileo was silenced by the church, it wasn't a clash between faith and science so much as a clash between the old rhythm and the new. The world was changing, but it wasn't yet ready to give up the comfort of stillness. In England, the hum of invention was beginning to rise in workshops and forges. The early seeds of the Industrial Revolution were being planted, though no one yet called it that. Artisans experimented with gears and levers. Blacksmiths hammered out machines that could pump water or spin thread. But even these machines were slow, deliberate, full of clanking and sighing, like tired beasts of burden. The smell of coal began to creep into the air, a scent that would one day define entire centuries. Yet, in these first moments, it was still faint, mixed with the smell of wet earth and wood smoke. The world's heartbeat began to quicken slightly, though most people still heard only the steady rhythm of their own routine. It is strange to imagine that while Newton was formulating the laws of motion, somewhere else a farmer was feeding chickens in the rain, utterly unaware that the very nature of motion was being redefined. That is the quiet cruelty of history. It changes, but it rarely announces itself. Across the seas, empires were expanding, their sails swelling with wind and greed. Ships carried not only goods, but also ideas, diseases, and despair. The new world was being mapped, claimed, and reshaped, often violently. But even in conquest, boredom lingered. Months at sea stretched endlessly, the horizon unchanged, the ocean a mirror of the sky. Men wrote letters they could never send, sang songs to keep from going mad, watched the same sun rise and set over waves that looked identical every day. For the sailors, history was not adventure, it was endurance. For the people they encountered, it was disruption disguised as destiny. The stories that fill our textbooks today, the discoveries, the conquests, the glory, were lived by people who mostly felt tired, cold, and uncertain. Even in the grandest moments of exploration, life was still a long, monotonous conversation with time. In the royal courts of Europe, the atmosphere was no less weary. Kings and queens dressed in silks and jewels to mask the tedium of power. Every day was a performance. Banquets, alliances, betrayals played out like clockwork. The court of Louis XIV in France glittered with gold and mirrors, yet beneath the surface it was suffocatingly ordered. Time itself was choreographed. When the king rose, everyone rose. When he dined, they dined. Even boredom was ritualized. The same conversations, the same gestures, the same faces. Life at Versailles was a slow dance inside a gilded cage. And yet, this too was history. The elegance of that age was not energy, but control. Not freedom, but repetition perfected. Philosophers, meanwhile, were beginning to question everything that seemed eternal. Descartes sat by his fire and wondered whether anything could be known for certain. "I think, therefore I am," he wrote, as if he were the first man to ever feel alone in his own mind. His words would echo through centuries, reshaping thought, but at the time, they were just another quiet reflection, written in the flicker of candlelight. That is how history moves, not in explosions, but in whispers. Behind every great discovery is a silence that lasts far longer than the noise that follows. In homes across Europe, people began to read more. Books of science, philosophy, and travel began to circulate among the educated, and with them came a subtle restlessness. Knowledge, once sacred, was now becoming ordinary. The novelty of learning began to dull. The more people knew, the less they felt they understood. Enlightenment promised illumination, but it also brought fatigue. When you stare at too much light, even truth begins to blur. The age of reason was not simply a triumph of logic, it was also the slow dawning of existential boredom. The realization that knowing the mechanism of the world does not necessarily make it more meaningful. Outside the cities, the world remained wrapped in fog and habit. Farmers still prayed for rain, children still played in mud, travelers still told the same old stories by firelight. The Enlightenment was a conversation that most people were not invited to join. For them, the stars still belonged to heaven, not to mathematics. And maybe that was a kind of peace that the thinkers had lost the ability to live without needing to explain everything. In that sense, the boring world of the common man was richer in silence than the minds of philosophers, who had filled theirs with endless questions. Then came the wars, the 30 Years' War, the English Civil War, the endless skirmishes of empire. They broke the illusion of reason's quiet progress. Villages burned, armies marched, and yet even war had its own monotony. Soldiers spent more days waiting than fighting, more hours hungry than heroic. The smoke of gunpowder mingled with the smell of bread baked in ashes. History books speak of battles, but the real story was boredom and fear stretched across months and years. When the smoke cleared, Europe was scarred, but somehow unchanged in its essence. The same rivers flowed, the same songs were sung, the same sun rose over a weary continent pretending to be new. And in the aftermath of all this, science began to take hold more firmly. The Royal Society in England gathered scholars who sought to study nature through observation rather than faith. Telescopes pointed upward, microscopes downward, and man began to see the universe as a collection of patterns rather than miracles. Yet, even this wonder was quiet. The discoveries were written in journals, exchanged in polite letters, debated. No one cheered in the streets when gravity was explained. No one stayed awake in awe at the thought of atoms. The most profound revelations of that age were met not with applause, but with yawns, because truth, when it becomes familiar, loses its thrill. By the end of the 17th century, the world had changed more than it realized. Maps were redrawn, ideas reordered, and yet the rhythm of daily life remained almost untouched. People still rose with the dawn, worked by the sun, and prayed by the stars. The future that was coming, the mechanical age, the industrial heartbeat, was still a whisper on the horizon. The silence before that storm was long and deep, filled with the soft murmur of windmills, the creak of wagons, the laughter of children chasing geese across cobblestones. It was an age that believed it was enlightened, yet still feared the dark. The boredom of history persisted because it was never really boredom, it was endurance, the patient hum beneath the noise of progress. And in that hum lay the continuity of humanity, the quiet, ceaseless pulse that carried the world from one age to another without ever breaking its rhythm. The Renaissance had taught men to dream. The Enlightenment taught them to think. But neither had yet taught them how to be still. The old world, though fading, had not yet vanished. It lingered like a ghost in the corners of new ideas, reminding mankind that As the 17th century quietly dissolved into the 18th, Europe exhaled a long, weary sigh. The world had grown clever, but not necessarily content. And in that strange in-between space between curiosity and comfort, time began to stretch like the shadow of evening. The age of enlightenment, as later historians would call it, was not a blaze of brilliance, but a slow flickering, the steady glow of 1,000 candles in 1,000 rooms, where people were trying to think their way out of mystery. But thought itself can be tiring. And even progress, when it comes to slowly, begins to feel like a kind of sleep. Across the cities of Europe, in Paris, London, Vienna, and Berlin, conversation became the new theater, reason the new faith, and wit the new weapon. Yet even as salons filled with laughter and arguments, outside those glittering rooms, the world remained unchanged. The same muddy roads, the same patient fields, the same rhythm of waking, working, and waiting for something that felt like destiny. The great irony of the Enlightenment was that while philosophers argued about liberty, equality, and the perfect society, most people were simply hoping for a good harvest and a mild winter. The world of ideas was growing restless. Writers filled pages with visions of a better humanity, and thinkers like Voltaire and Rousseau poured their frustrations into elegant sentences. They questioned kings and priests, exposed hypocrisy, and imagined a world guided by reason rather than authority. But if you had stood on the streets of Paris in 1750, you would not have seen revolution. You would have seen bakers opening shops, servants sweeping steps, children chasing each other through alleys, soldiers polishing buttons in the cold morning light. History's greatest upheavals always begin invisibly as ordinary days. The minds that were preparing to reshape civilization were hidden among the countless faces of people who would never know their names. Even as Voltaire mocked superstition, the bells of Notre Dame still rang every morning. and the faithful still crossed themselves as they had for 1,000 years. Progress walked softly, almost shyly, through a world still half asleep. Meanwhile, science continued its quiet conquest of wonder. Isaac Newton's laws had given the universe a mechanical heartbeat, and with that discovery came a peculiar kind of pistha, comfort of predictability. The planets moved not by divine whim but by mathematical grace, and the heavens, once alive with gods and angels, were now silent and orderly. Some found that silence beautiful, others found it unbearable. The poets mourned the loss of mystery, the philosophers celebrated the triumph of logic, and the common people, caught between them, continued their slow lives under the same indifferent stars. The Enlightenment had promised light, but light can be cold, and beneath its glow many felt the chill of meaning slipping away. In England, the clatter of machines was growing louder. Steam engines, coal furnaces, spinning frames, the early inventions of the Industrial Revolution were beginning to stir. What had once been the rhythm of hand and muscle was being replaced by the relentless pulse of gears. The first factories rose like temples to a new kind of God, efficiency. Yet at this stage, it was still a quiet revolution. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, wheels turned with a measured patience, and the workers, men, women, and even children, moved through their tasks like parts of the machines they served. They were not yet slaves to industry, only apprentices to it. The idea that these humming workshops would one day reshape the entire planet was still unimaginable. The smell of coal and iron was just another note in the background hum of existence. The cities themselves began to change shape. Streets grew wider, lamps were lit at night, carriages rattled through the fog, and somewhere in the crowd, a new figure appeared, the modern citizen. No longer just a subject of kings or a child of faith. This man or woman was learning to think of themselves as part of something broader, society. Newspapers carried gossip, philosophy, and scandal in equal measure. Coffee houses became centers of conversation where tradesmen and scholars shared the same tables. But even in this new social energy, there was monotony. The same debates, the same complaints, the same endless discussions about freedom and order repeated themselves every day, as if mankind had become addicted to its own noise. The Enlightenment, for all its brilliance, was also the beginning of intellectual fatigue beyond Europe. The empires expanded with both ambition and arrogance. Ships crossed the oceans in greater numbers, carrying goods, people, and ideas to every corner of the world. Colonies grew like shadows cast by distant crowns. The maps became crowded with new names, new borders, new claims, but for the sailors and settlers, the days were long, the work hard, and the novelty wore thin. Exploration had become administration, adventure replaced by routine. The same tides rose and fell, the same stars guided ships home, and even in the heart of empire, boredom reigned. History was moving outward, but it still moved at the same slow pace, like a tide too gentle to notice in a single lifetime. The philosophers of the time believed they were building a rational paradise. They believed that if mankind could just think clearly enough, the world would become good. But thought has its limits. Reason can illuminate, but it cannot warm. And so, beneath the surface of the Enlightenment's calm, emotion began to stir again. Art, music, and literature grew weary of symmetry and order. People longed for feeling, for passion, for something that reason could not explain. This yearning gave birth to the Romantic movement, though it would not yet have a name. Painters began to fill their canvases with storms and ruins. Poets began to write about loneliness and nature, and composers began to create music that swelled and wept and reached for something beyond logic. It was as if the soul of humanity, tired of being dissected by science, had begun to cry out for mystery once more. And yet, for most, life continued as always. The baker still rose before dawn. The farmer still watched the weather. The tailor still mended coats, and the soldier still polished his boots. The Enlightenment may have changed the way people thought, but it did not change the way they lived. The rhythm of survival remained untouched. It is easy, from the distance of centuries, to imagine the 18th century as a golden age of reason and refinement. But for the majority, it was still an age of hunger and waiting. Bread remained more important than philosophy, and warmth more precious than wisdom. The great thinkers debated liberty in salons, while peasants froze in cottages whose roofs leaked with every rain. The gap between thought and reality widened, and in that gap, the future quietly prepared its revolutions in the grand palaces of Europe. Kings continued to dance to the same music, unaware that the floor beneath them was cracking. Louis XVI in France dined lavishly, surrounded by gold, while outside the streets whispered of hunger. The philosophers had taught the people to question, and once a question begins, it cannot easily be silenced. The Enlightenment's calm reasoning gave way to the storm of revolution, but even that storm, when it came, had its own rhythm of repetition: marches, speeches, battles, and executions, each day blurring into the next. The guillotine became as ordinary as the church bell once was, marking the hours with its terrible regularity. Progress and horror often walk hand in hand, and the dawn of freedom looked very much like another night by the end of the 18th century. The Enlightenment's light was dimming, replaced by the smoke of factories and the fire of rebellion. The age of reason had promised peace but delivered upheaval. Yet, through it all, the ancient rhythm of life endured. Mothers still sang lullabies, lovers still whispered in the dark, and old men still sat by hearths, staring into the same flames that had warmed their ancestors. The machinery of history kept turning, but the essence of existence remained unchanged. The boredom of the past, that steady pulse of human endurance, was still the foundation of everything new. When we look back at that time now, it seems filled with brilliance. Newton, Voltaire, Mozart, Rousseau, Franklin, but behind every genius were thousands of nameless souls living the same slow, repetitive lives. They are the true authors of history, the quiet majority whose monotony built the stage for every moment of brilliance. Their silence was the soil in which progress grew. Without them, there would be no enlightenment, no revolution, no modern world. Theirs was the long patience of humanity itself. And so, as the 18th century gave way to the 19th, the world stood once more at the edge of transformation. The air was thick with smoke and anticipation. The machines were stirring restlessly, and reason was giving way to emotion, to the roar of industry and the cry of individuality. But before that great awakening came, there was a moment of perfect stillness, final breath of the old world, heavy with the scent of candle wax, ink, and wood smoke. It was the quiet before the storm, the long, slow exhale of a civilization that had spent centuries trying to think itself awake. As the 18th century faded like the dying echo of a harpsichord, the world began to hum with a strange new sound, the rhythm of engines. The Industrial Revolution did not burst onto the scene with drama. It crept quietly through the fog of English towns and the narrow alleys of coal-stained villages. The sound of hammers, gears, and steam joined the chorus of roosters, church bells, and market cries that had defined life for centuries. It was the sound of progress, though no one at the time would have called it that. To those who lived it, it was simply noise-steady, mechanical, persistent. The smell of coal smoke mingled with the scent of wet wool and bread, and the air itself seemed to thicken with effort. What had once been the rhythm of the plow and the hand loom was now the hiss of pistons, the groan of iron, the sigh of steam. Time itself began to change its shape, shrinking from the vast cycles of nature into the ticking of machines. Yet even this new tempo, faster and sharper, was just another verse in humanity's long song of repetition. The boredom of history did not vanish. It simply found new instruments in the towns of northern England. Manchester, Birmingham leads the transformation was both magnificent and monotonous. Great factories rose like gray cathedrals, their windows trembling with the endless motion of looms. Inside, the air was thick with lint and sweat. Men, women, and children moved in rhythm with the machines, their bodies learning to mimic the precision of iron. 4, 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours a day. They worked beneath the dull light of soot-streaked windows, their world reduced to motion and sound. Progress had given them wages, but it had taken their silence. The calm slowness of rural life was replaced by the constant murmur of industry, and though historians would later call this the dawn of modernity, it was, for those who lived it, a kind of waking sleep. They rose before the sun, worked until after dark, and returned home too weary to dream. Outside the factories, the cities grew swollen with smoke and hope. Streets once meant for carriages now teemed with carts, vendors, beggars, and children with faces smudged like coal. The nights glowed faintly orange from the fires of furnaces. The rivers, once clear, ran thick with dyes and ash. Yet amid this filth and fatigue, there was also wonder. New machines were being invented almost daily, spinning frames, steam engines, locomotives. The idea of speed itself became intoxicating. For the first time in history, humanity could move faster than its own feet. Trains began to cut through the countryside, their iron wheels screaming like a prophecy. People gathered at stations just to watch them pass, astonished that something so heavy could move so smoothly. And yet, after a few years, even trains became ordinary, their marvel dulled by repetition. The miracle of motion became background noise, folded into the same boredom that had always accompanied progress. In the countryside, silence lingered a little longer. The farmers who remained watched smoke rising from distant cities and wondered if it was a sign of prosperity or doom. Their own lives changed more slowly, but change came nonetheless. Machines began to plow fields and thresh grain, replacing the strength of oxen and the patience of men. The barns grew emptier, the villages quieter. Sons left for the city, daughters followed, and the old world began to empty itself out. The land that had once been full of song and footstep fell still, save for the wind moving through the hedges. Nature, long the companion of human labor, began to grow lonely. Even the seasons seemed confused, for the rhythm of industry did not respect the rhythm of the sun. Work continued, whether it was harvest or frost. Time was no longer a circlet, had become a line, straight, endless, and exhausting, across Europe. And soon across the ocean, the same transformation took hold. In France, in Germany, in America, machines multiplied like thoughts in the minds of dreamers. The world that had once taken centuries to change, now changed in decades. The telegraph connected distant lands in seconds. Steamships crossed oceans in weeks instead of months. Progress had never been so loud. The more connected people became, the more they seemed to drift apart. Letters were replaced by wires, conversations by clicks. Factories produced goods faster than they could be consumed, and yet, strangely, time still felt slow to those who lived within the rhythm of work. The boredom of repetition had not been defeated by innovation. It had simply changed costume, wearing soot instead of silence. And yet, amid this new age of iron and invention, the human spirit found ways to adapt. The romantic poets wandered through misty hills and wrote of lost innocence, their hearts aching for the slower beauty of the past. Artists painted ruins, sunsets, and storms, as if trying to remind a world of smoke what wind once felt like. Musicians composed symphonies that mimicked the roar of machines and the beating of human hearts trapped inside them. Even the inventors themselves sometimes paused to wonder what they had unleashed. James Watt, who perfected the steam engine, once said that he felt both proud and frightened by what he had built. Every new invention, it seemed, carried a faint echo of regret. In drawing rooms and taverns, people began to debate the meaning of progress. Was it truly improvement or merely movement? Philosophers like John Stuart Mill asked whether wealth and work could ever make people truly happy. Others, like Marx, warned that industry was not liberation, but a new kind of bondage, one that enslaved the worker, not with chains, but with necessity. But such questions, however profound, could not slow the machines. The looms kept turning, the pistons kept pounding, and the world marched on. The industrial age was not built on ideas, but on endurance. And so life continued louder, faster, but not necessarily brighter. The new cities, though alive with energy, were also suffocating with sameness. Rows of identical houses stretched endlessly, the sky above them gray with smoke. Even beauty seemed to have been standardized. The faces in the crowd were tired but determined, their expressions shaped by the rhythm of the clock. Sunday was the only day when silence returned, when the factories rested and people remembered what stillness sounded like. On those mornings, the city would seem almost holy, its air clear, its bells echoing faintly through the smog. But even that peace was temporary. By Monday, the machines would wake again, and the world would resume its endless hum. Beyond the cities, on distant continents, the same hum spread. Steamships carried goods and greed across the seas, laying the foundations of empires built on industry. Colonies supplied raw materials and received the finished products of their own labor. It was the age of iron, but also the age of irony. The very progress that promised equality deepened the divisions between those who built the machines and those who merely fed them. The rhythm of boredom had become global. From the cotton mills of Manchester to the sugar fields of the Caribbean, from the coal mines of Wales to the ports of Bombay, humanity worked to the same slow, relentless beat. And yet, for all its monotony, this was also an age of quiet miracles. At night, gas lamps flickered along cobblestone streets, illuminating faces that had never known such light before. The darkness that once belonged only to the moon and stars was now shared with human invention. Children read by lamplight. Lovers walked under glowing arches. Old men sat on porches, watching shadows that were no longer shadows at all. Progress, for all its fatigue, had a strange kind of tenderness. Even in the soot and the noise, there was beauty, the beauty of survival, of persistence, of finding grace in repetition. And so, as the 19th century deepened, the world became both more alive and more asleep. The machines roared, but the people inside them dreamed. They dreamed of rest, of freedom, of something beyond the gray horizon. Yet the truth remained unchanged. History is a slow dance, and even revolution has a rhythm. The boredom of the past is not its flaw, it is its foundation, the steady heartbeat that keeps time from collapsing into chaos. And as the world continued to turn faster and faster, beneath clouds of smoke and sparks, it carried within it the same eternal pulse that had echoed through every age before it, the quiet, enduring breath of human existence. As the 19th century drifted toward its twilight, and the 20th waited like an impatient guest at the door, humanity found itself standing in a fog of invention, exhaustion, and quiet awe. The steam engines that had once seemed godlike now appeared quaint beside the hum of electricity. The world was lighting itself up from within, glowing like a lantern in the dark. Cities became constellations, each bulb a small defiance against night. In the silence that followed the roar of the Industrial Revolution came a new kind of hum, the electric buzz, faint and constant, that would soon become the background sound of modern life. It was progress once more, though progress now flickered rather than thundered. People were learning to measure time not by the motion of pistons, but by the flicker of filaments. And yet, beneath the light, life remained the same repetitive melody of work, hunger, sleep, and dream. The boredom of history, eternal and patient, simply learned how to glow in London, Paris, and New York. Gas lamps gave way to incandescent bulbs, and night ceased to mean rest. Shops stayed open longer. Factories never truly slept. The rhythm of life stretched thinner, taut like a string, until people could no longer tell where one day ended and the next began. In this new world of constant light, the stars above seemed dimmer, as if retreating from competition. Poets mourned their fading brilliance, but most people barely noticed. They were too busy living beneath their own manufactured stars. The city at night was beautiful in a strange, feverish way. Streets alive with the footsteps of workers, carriages clattering over cobblestones, newspapers whispering the news of distant wars and nearer scandals. It was a world of movement, ceaseless and glittering. And yet, if one stopped to listen, there was still a silence underneath the silence of exhaustion, of repetition, of the same hands performing the same tasks under new kinds of light. In the factories that had survived the first great wave of industrial change, the machines grew smaller, faster, more precise, Assembly lines replaced the chaos of workshops, and human beings became living extensions of their tools. Henry Ford's factories in America would one day perfect this system, but its spirit was already alive in the humming warehouses of the late 19th century. Workers stood side by side, repeating the same motions for hours, days, years. The efficiency was magnificent, the monotony sublime in its cruelty. The world now prized productivity over purpose. And though the new century promised invention, what it delivered first was repetition made holy. The machine had not enslaved mankind. Mankind had chosen to imitate it. Outside the walls of industry, society itself began to mechanize. The streets filled with new kinds of order trams, gliding in straight lines. Clocks keeping cities synchronized. Newspapers delivering the same stories to millions. Even leisure became a system. Parks were designed, theaters scheduled, holidays declared. Humanity, for all its dreams of freedom, found comfort in the predictability of pattern. The same newspapers, the same songs, the same dances, repeated across continents, until even culture became industrial. The boredom of history was no longer confined to scholars, and philosophers had become the quiet rhythm of daily life. Yet it was in this monotony that something extraordinary began to stir. The boredom itself became a kind of mirror, forcing people to look inward. The fin de siècle, the end of the century, was filled with restless souls searching for meaning in the machinery. Artists painted dreams instead of factories. Writers wrote of alienation and time. In Vienna, Freud listened to the confessions of the unconscious, discovering that the mind itself was an engine of repetition. In Paris, Monet stood before the same pond again and again, painting the light as it changed by inches, teaching the world that boredom could be beauty if seen closely enough. And in Norway, a man named Munch screamed across a bridge, his face echoing the anxiety of a century that could no longer find silence. The boredom of history had become art. Science, too, began to question the clockwork it had once worshipped. Einstein would soon show that even time was not fixed but flexible, bending and stretching like fabric. The universe was not a perfect machine, it was a dream in motion. But before these revelations, the world remained deeply material, obsessed with invention. The telephone carried voices across distance. The phonograph captured them in wax. And the first cameras turned fleeting moments into permanent ghosts. Each of these marvels promised to conquer time, but instead they deepened humanity's fascination with its passing. People began to fear boredom as if it were death itself. They filled their lives with gadgets, spectacles, and news, each invention meant to distract from the eternal slowness beneath progress. Meanwhile, empires reached their zeniths and began to tremble under their own weight. The boredom of the rich grew decadent, the boredom of the poor unbearable. In colonial capitals, time moved differently, slow and heavy, like the sun over deserts and jungles. The European world, for all its technology, still depended on the ancient rhythms of labor extracted from distant lands. Cotton still needed to be picked, tea still needed to be dried, coal still needed to be mined. The world had become interconnected, but not united. Beneath the hum of progress lay the heartbeat of exploitation. And yet, even this, in the grand rhythm of history, felt inevitable. Another repetition, another verse in the long song of power. By the end of the century, people began to sense that something was coming. The air was thick with invention and anxiety. Cities grew taller, louder, more crowded. Machines took to the sky in fragile flight. Cables carried messages beneath the sea. It was as if humanity were trying to escape the weight of its own history by moving faster than boredom could follow. But boredom, like a shadow, always kept pace. Even in the most dazzling moments, the first photograph, the first flight, the first electric concerto, was always someone yawning in the background, unimpressed. It was not cynicism, but fatigue. Humanity had been reinventing itself for so long that it forgot what stillness felt like in parlors and universities. Philosophers began to whisper of ennui, a French word that meant more than boredom. Something heavier, like the sigh of civilization itself. Life had become too full of novelty, too crowded with invention. Nothing amazed for long. The new century promised wonders: automobiles, telegraphs, motion pictures, but each wonder, once seen, immediately became routine. The great irony of progress was that it multiplied miracles until they felt ordinary. The boredom of history was not defeated by technology. It had simply evolved, and then came war. Not a noble clash of kings and knights, but an industrial storm. The same machines that had built cities now tore them apart. The same factories that had woven cloth now produced shells. The hum of progress became the roar of artillery. Soldiers marched to the front as if entering a factory line, their fates produced with mechanical precision. The First World War was the tragic climax of the industrial age, a collision of steel, smoke, and human exhaustion. And when it was over, the survivors did not return to peace so much as to silence. The noise had ended, but the boredom returned, heavier than before. In the aftermath, the world tried to find meaning again. The roaring 20s danced to forget. Jazz replacing the hum of machines with the syncopation of survival. But even jazz, with all its wild energy, could not hold off the creeping sameness of time. The depression came, gray and patient, and the world slowed once more. History, it seemed, was not a line. After all, it was a pendulum, swinging between motion and stillness, noise and silence, hope and fatigue. Humanity, for all its brilliance, remained trapped within its rhythm, and so the 19th century faded into memory. The 20th took its first breath, and the same eternal story continued to unfold. People building, dreaming, growing tired, and building again. The factories still hummed, the lights still burned, and the stars still hid behind the haze of ambition. The boredom of history, far from being its curse, was its continuity. It was what made the world stable enough to endure, patient enough to evolve, and quiet enough to reflect. Beneath every revolution, beneath every invention, beneath every dream of progress, there remained that same soft, steady heartbeat, the sound of time itself, repeating endlessly, waiting for us to listen. As the 20th century unfolded like a restless dream, the world began to hum with new kinds of boredom, bright, electric, and restless. The machine age had matured into something subtler, something woven into every breath of modern life. The cities that had once choked on smoke now glittered with neon. The clatter of factories softened into the quiet ticking of office clocks. The great industrial symphony had given way to the murmur of bureaucracy, to the rustle of paper and the steady hum of typewriters. Humanity had tamed noise, and replaced it with monotony. Progress no longer, thundered it whispered, politely, through telephones and elevator chimes. Yet beneath this new sophistication, the same rhythm endured, repetition disguised as advancement, fatigue dressed as purpose. The boredom of history had put on a new suit, sleek and modern, but it was still the same ancient melody, looping endlessly in the background of civilization's dreams. The early decades of the century were defined by the illusion of novelty. Automobiles rolled through streets once ruled by horses. Airplanes sliced through skies that had belonged only to birds. Radios brought voices from invisible distances, and cinema gave shape to fantasies that once lived only in imagination. People watched, listened, consumed, and forgot. Each invention dazzled for a season, then settled into the background hum of normality. A man who had once wept to hear a voice over radio waves now simply turned the dial, impatient for a clearer signal. The miracle had become mundane, as all miracles do. Yet progress marched on, its steps perfectly measured, each echo falling into the same rhythm as the centuries before. The boredom of the future was being born in real time. Then came another war greater, louder, more mechanized than the first. The world once again surrendered to its machinery, but now the machines flew, burned, and vaporized. The Second World War was the ultimate expression of industrial power turned against itself. Factories became engines of destruction, and cities, once proud symbols of progress, became piles of ash. The hum of civilization was replaced by the scream of sirens, the roar of engines, the silence of loss. Yet, even in war, boredom persisted. The long hours in trenches, the waiting, the repetition of fear. Humanity discovered that even terror, when repeated enough, becomes routine. The boredom of survival was as old as the boredom of peace. When it was over, the world rebuilt, as it always did, and called the ruins lessons. But history's lessons are soft-spoken, and time has a way of talking over them. In the post-war years, the rhythm of progress accelerated again. The age of machines gave way to the age of information. Television replaced the hearth. The glowing screen replaced the family circle. People began to live through images, to measure their lives in programs and broadcasts. The miracle of seeing distant faces in motion felt like magic, but soon it too became part of the daily blur. News, entertainment, advertisement all streamed together until reality itself began to feel rehearsed. The boredom of modernity was no longer slow. It was fast, loud, and omnipresent. The more humanity tried to fill its time, the more time seemed to vanish. The clock no longer ticked, it pulsed, digital and cold, marking moments too small to feel. The decades that followed brought abundance, convenience, and a peculiar emptiness. Cars became faster, homes became smaller, and cities stretched higher into the sky. Airplanes turned continents into neighborhoods, and yet people felt further apart than ever. The world was shrinking, but loneliness was expanding. The boredom of repetition had been replaced by the boredom of speed, a restlessness that no amount of novelty could satisfy. The 20th century had made boredom modern, global, and deeply human. It had turned it from a condition of slowness into a symptom of too much motion. In a sense, the world had become too interesting to bear. By the 1960s, the dream of progress began to tremble under its own brilliance. The same generation that had inherited the atomic age now marched in the streets, demanding meaning in a world that had too much power and too little purpose. Music changed. It began to stretch, distort, rebel. The Beatles sang of revolution. Bob Dylan mumbled of change. And yet, beneath the protest, there was still the same slow pulse of repetition, the same cycle of hope and fatigue. Each generation believed it was different. Each one discovered it was not. The boredom of history had simply changed costumes again, wearing guitars instead of steam, slogans instead of smoke. Even rebellion, repeated enough, becomes tradition. The late 20th century brought new miracles that promised to end boredom forever. Computers, satellites, and, finally, the internet. For the first time, humanity was connected in real time, across oceans and borders, through invisible threads of light. Information flowed like water, unstoppable, endless. Everything was known, everything was visible, and yet, somehow, everything felt smaller. The world's mysteries were solved faster than they could be missed. People stared at glowing screens and called it connection. But beneath the blue light lay the same old silence, the same longing for something beyond the endless scroll of days. The boredom of history had become digital, but it had not disappeared. It had simply learned to hide behind brightness. And so humanity entered its newest chapter, the age of everything. The future arrived quietly, without fanfare, disguised as convenience. Machines became invisible inside pockets, inside homes, inside minds. The hum of industry was replaced by the whisper of Wi-Fi, the soft buzz of notifications, the gentle vibration of algorithms feeding the illusion of motion. People no longer worked beside machines. They lived inside them. Time, once measured by sun and season, now existed in pixels. The rhythm of life was not determined by nature or labor, but by the blinking of screens. And though the world had never been more alive with sound, light, and possibility, there was an unmistakable stillness beneath it, all a tiredness that felt ancient, familiar, inevitable. The boredom of history had finally become invisible, omnipresent, eternal. In this new age, progress meant comfort, and comfort meant stillness. No one starved, but few were satisfied. The hunger that once drove invention had been replaced by craving, endless, formless, unsatisfied. People scrolled through lives that were not their own, read headlines they would forget by noon, watched stories that blurred together like dreams. The miracle of information had turned into a storm of noise, and meaning, that old friend of boredom, drowned quietly beneath it. The ancient philosophers, who once warned that too much ease breeds emptiness, would have nodded in weary recognition. The world had conquered hardship only to be defeated by abundance. And yet, amid this quiet storm of distraction, there were still those who listened to silence, to slowness, to history's steady heartbeat. Some walked away from the screens and sought the old rhythms again, the rhythm of waves, of footsteps, of breath. They found, to their surprise, that the boredom they had feared was not an enemy but a teacher. It was in boredom that the mind began to see clearly, to dream deeply, to remember itself. The very slowness that progress had tried to erase turned out to be the one thing that could still heal. The boredom of history, once mocked, once dreaded, was revealed as the keeper of balance. Without it, humanity would burn itself out in motion, And so the story continues, as it always has. The tools change, the speed shifts, the language evolves, but the rhythm remains the same. Progress and pause, creation and collapse, noise and silence. The boredom of history is not a flaw to be fixed, but a pulse to be understood. It reminds us that behind every empire, every invention, every glowing screen, there is still the quiet beating of a human heart, steady, imperfect, eternal. We have been here before, and we will be here again. The details may change, but the melody will not. The song of history is slow, repetitive, and, if you listen long enough, strangely beautiful. It is the lullaby of civilizations, the sound that carries us from dawn to dusk, from revolution to rest, from beginning to beginning again. And so, as the lights of the modern world shimmer through glass towers and satellites blink like mechanical stars, one truth endures: we are still children of time, playing in its shadow, building and breaking, dreaming and dozing, moving and waiting. The boredom of history is our inheritance, our burden, and our comfort. It is what ties us to the past, and what quietly reminds us that even the future will grow old. And perhaps in that realization, there is peace, the gentle peace of knowing that nothing, not even progress, can escape the soft, slow embrace of time.